It was bittersweet, and I use the word bitter not as strong as it means. I hated to leave my family, my friends. However, I was thrilled that I still had a job. I mean, I didn't know for sure. And from what I heard later, the people out here in L.A., they wanted the local announcers who had been doing the Coast League. They wanted them. And Walter O'Malley said, no, I'm bringing my two. And thank goodness Jerry Doggett and I came out here. Well, when you're doing our games, local teams, you're not just interested in doing the game. You're trying to sell. You're trying to get people to come to the ballpark. If you're talking directly to the fans, that's a lot better than talking to somebody else.
Vin Scully once said the words, "I hate his guts," and baseball fans have never forgotten it. That phrase has circled the internet for years, attached to a story that sounds almost too good to be true. A man so calm, so poetic, so universally beloved that he once made a crowd in New York City go completely silent just by describing a moment on a baseball field. That man named players he hated. That is what we are here to talk about today. If this story is already pulling you in, go ahead and hit the hype button and give this video some love so more baseball fans find it. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. Now, before we go any further, let us get something straight. The headline is not exactly what you think it is. The idea that Vin Scully sat down somewhere and rattled off a list of 4 players he absolutely despised is a mischaracterization. It is the kind of framing that turns a nuanced, layered, fascinating piece of sports history into something that fits on a thumbnail. And yes, this thumbnail got you here, which means it worked. But the real story is far more interesting than the clickbait version. Across 67 seasons behind the microphone with the Dodgers, from Brooklyn all the way to Los Angeles, Vin Scully built a reputation that was essentially without equal in the world of sports broadcasting. He was not just a voice, he was an institution, a living connection between the game and the people who loved it. He combined poetic language with ice-cold objectivity in a way that nobody has ever fully replicated. And central to everything he stood for was a code of professional decorum so strict, so unwavering, that even his closest friends admitted they could never detect his private feelings during a live broadcast. That is how locked in this man was. So when historians and the people closest to Scully confirmed that, yes, there were exactly 4 players who created genuine friction with this legend, the story stops being about a list of players he hated. It becomes something much richer. It becomes a story about what it actually took to get under the skin of the most composed, most respected broadcaster in baseball history. 4 moments, 4 players across 67 seasons. That is how rare this was. And the 4 names that come up are Mike Marshall, Eddie Murray, Mike Piazza, and Jeff Kent. But we are going to tell this story in a different order, because the more recent the friction, the more public it became. And public friction is a very different animal from the quiet, private disdain that Scully carried for decades without ever letting it slip on air. So we are starting at the end of the timeline and working backward. We start with number 4. Number 4 is Jeff Kent, second baseman, decent career, 5-time All-Star, won an MVP in 2000. And in the summer of 2008, at 40 years old, playing for the Dodgers, Jeff Kent decided to pick a public fight with the most beloved man in Los Angeles. That is either brave or foolish, depending on how you look at it. Most people who watched it unfold settled pretty quickly on the second one. Here is what happened. In late July of 2008, the Dodgers made one of the most electric trades in recent franchise history. They acquired Manny Ramirez from the Boston Red Sox. Manny brought that unmistakable energy, that powerful bat, and that absolute chaos energy that only Manny could bring. And almost immediately, something interesting happened on the stat sheet. Jeff Kent, who had been having a quietly decent season, suddenly caught fire. After Manny joined the lineup, Kent batted .500, not for a week, for a stretch that had scouts and analysts pulling out their notebooks. Now, for anyone who watches baseball closely, the explanation is not mysterious. It is called lineup protection. When a dangerous hitter like Manny Ramirez is batting behind you or around you in the order, pitchers cannot afford to nibble. They cannot throw you junk outside the zone and hope you chase, because if they walk you, they have to face Manny. And so they come to you with better pitches, more fastballs, more pitches in the strike zone, which means a professional hitter who knows what he is doing is going to do a lot more damage. This is not a complicated concept. It is Baseball 101. It is discussed in broadcasts, in newspapers, in the dugout, everywhere. It is not a knock on the hitter. It is just an honest explanation of what is happening. Vin Scully noted this on air. He said, in the way only Scully could say things, that Kent was benefiting from the lineup protection that Manny provided. He was not saying Kent was a fraud. He was not saying Kent was lucky. He was describing the game the way he always did, honestly, clearly, with total respect for the facts. Jeff Kent did not see it that way. Not even a little bit. Kent went to sports writer T.J. Simers and unloaded. His exact words were something along the lines of, Vin Scully talks too much. He said it felt like an insult. He said the lineup protection comment diminished his entire career and everything he had worked for. He even questioned whether Scully actually knew him as a person, asking out loud how Scully could possibly know who Jeff Kent was if Scully did not spend time in the clubhouse with the players. Let that sink in for a second. Jeff Kent was publicly challenging the knowledge and the motives of a man who had been broadcasting baseball since 1950, not a man who had called games involving some of the greatest players in the history of the sport, a man who understood the nuance and texture of baseball at a level that very few people, players included, ever reached. And Kent's argument was essentially that Scully did not know enough. The response from fans was swift and pretty uniform. It was an overreaction, a defensive, prickly overreaction from a player who was well known in clubhouses around the league for being difficult to deal with. This was not a new side of Jeff Kent. His famously combustible relationship with Barry Bonds in San Francisco was well documented. Kent had a reputation for being quick to take offense and slow to let things go. And in this case, rather than appreciating what any honest analyst would tell him, which is that Manny Ramirez being in that lineup made his job easier, Kent turned it into a personal attacks on one of the most respected men in baseball. Scully did what Scully always did. He said nothing. He did not fire back. He did not complain to reporters. He did not even acknowledge that there was a conflict worth addressing. He just kept showing up, kept calling games, kept being the voice that Los Angeles had relied on for more than half a century. And in doing so, he won the argument without saying a word. The thing about Jeff Kent's outburst is that it tells you more about Kent than it does about Scully. Scully's comment about lineup protection was not malicious. It was not targeted. It was the kind of analytical observation that any smart broadcast would include. But Kent could not separate the analysis from the feeling that his hard work was being minimized. And instead of letting it go, he swung at one of the most untouchable figures in the sport. It was the kind of move that fans and history do not forget. Number 3 is Mike Piazza. And if Jeff Kent's story is about a prickly veteran who could not take fair analysis, Mike Piazza's story is about a superstar who rewrote history in his own autobiography to blame someone else for his own decisions. This one gets a little deeper and a little messier. To understand the Piazza situation, you have to go back to 1998. Mike Piazza at that point was arguably the best offensive catcher in the history of the game. The numbers were just absurd. In 1997 alone, he batted .362 with 40 home runs and 124 runs batted in. For a catcher. Those are numbers that belong in a conversation about the best hitters in baseball, regardless of position. He was the face of the franchise. He was beloved in Los Angeles. He was everything the Dodgers had in terms of a marketable superstar at that particular moment. And then contract negotiations started, and things got complicated fast. The Dodgers offered Piazza a 6-year deal worth $76 million, which, it should be said, would have made him one of the highest paid players in baseball at the time. But Piazza wanted more. He wanted 7 years and $105 million. The gap between those two numbers became a massive public story. The negotiations dragged out. Fans started to take sides. The media covered every development. And at some point during all of this, Piazza sat down for a spring training interview on Cato with Vin Scully. What happened in that interview became the center of a controversy that did not fully explode until 2013, when Piazza published his autobiography called Long Shot. In that book, Piazza made a claim that stopped a lot of people cold. He wrote that as the contract drama escalated and fans were turning on him, Vin Scully was crushing him, his words, crushing him. He said that Scully used the platform of Dodgers broadcasts to turn the Los Angeles fan base against him by framing his contract demands as a lack of loyalty. He also made a second claim. He said Scully had cost him the 1996 National League MVP award by overpraising winner Ken Caminiti on Dodger broadcasts, which he believed shifted public perception and ultimately influenced the voting. These were serious accusations against a man who had spent his entire career doing the exact opposite of what Piazza was describing. And when reporters went back and actually reviewed the K-Tila broadcast in question, what they found was that Scully's interview was not crushing. It was not a hit piece. It was not designed to make Piazza look bad. Scully actually gave Piazza a very specific and generous opportunity during that interview. He gave Piazza the chance to clarify that his contract position was not an ultimatum to the team. He essentially offered Piazza an open door to reframe the entire narrative in his favor, and Piazza did not take it. He responded with the kind of generic athletic non-answers that communicates nothing and satisfies nobody. The interview was entirely fair, more than fair. Scully had gone out of his way to give Piazza a chance to connect with the fan base and explain himself. When the accusations became public, Scully's response was telling. He said he was flabbergasted. He said he was aghast. Those words matter. Not angry. not defensive. Flabbergasted, because for a man whose entire professional identity was built on the principle of never criticizing players and never discussing their contract situations on air, being accused of doing exactly that was not just an insult. It was a fundamental misreading of who he was and what he stood for. Scully reiterated his policy clearly. He did not attack Piazza personally. He did not say Piazza was lying, even though the record did not support Piazza's version. He simply restated what he had always believed and always practiced. His job was to call games. His job was to tell stories that connected fans to the game. His job was not to be an opinion machine for or against any player. The deeper layer to the Piazza story is what it reveals about Piazza himself. His resentment toward the Dodgers ran so deep that when he was finally inducted into the Hall of Fame, he refused to go in wearing a Dodgers cap. He declined subsequent honors from the team. The bitterness was real and it was lasting. And part of that bitterness, whether justified or not, landed on Vin Scully, a man who by every objective measure did right by Piazza during that interview. What Piazza could not accept, or maybe could not see, was that the fan backlash he experienced was not caused by Vin Scully. It was caused by the situation itself. When a player the city loves demands more money than the team is willing to pay, and when the negotiations become public, fans are going to have feelings. That is not broadcasting. That is human nature. Scully did not create those feelings. He was just the most prominent voice in the room when they were already boiling. And the MVP accusation is even harder to support. The idea that praising Ken Caminiti, who put together one of the most remarkable individual offensive seasons in National League history in 1996, somehow cost Piazza votes is a stretch that requires a certain kind of self-focus to maintain. Caminiti won the award because he earned it. Scully covering that performance accurately was not an act of sabotage against Piazza. It was journalism, but Piazza needed someone to blame. And Scully, the most visible media voice connected to the Dodgers, became that target. The irony is that in doing so, Piazza managed to cast himself as the villain of his own story while trying to make Scully the problem. Fans who went back and watched that interview almost universally came away with the same conclusion. Scully was professional. Scully was fair. Scully gave Piazza every chance to come out of it looking good, and Piazza squandered it. Number 2 is Eddie Murray. And this one is quieter than the Piazza and Kent situations, much quieter. So quiet, in fact, that most fans had no idea it was happening while Scully was still actively broadcasting. This is one of those stories that only surfaced through the testimonies of people who were close to Scully. And the person who confirmed it most directly was legendary Los Angeles sports writer Jim Murray, who was one of Scully's closest and most trusted friends. Jim Murray was a Pulitzer Prize winner. He was one of the most celebrated sports columnists in American history. And he and Vin Scully were genuinely close, the kind of close where private thoughts actually got shared. And what Jim Murray confirmed was that across Scully's entire 67-season career, there were exactly 2 players he genuinely privately disliked, not criticized on air, not complained about publicly, privately disliked. 2 players in 67 years. That is how selective and how disciplined this man was. Eddie Murray was one of those 2. Eddie Murray played for the Dodgers from 1989 to 1991, and he's just briefly again in 1997. In terms of pure production, he was elite. In 1990, he was the Dodgers' best offensive player by a wide margin. He appeared in 155 games, batted .330, hit 26 home runs, drove in 95 runs, and collected 184 hits. Those are numbers that would make any front office happy. On the field, Murray delivered. Consistently, professionally, without complaint about his role or his usage. He was the kind of hitter who showed up every day and punished pitchers who made mistakes. A switch hitter with real power from both sides of the plate, which is a combination so rare that teams spend years trying to develop it and almost never do. His 1990 season alone was the kind of campaign that reminds you of why the Dodgers went out and acquired him in the first place. He was worth every cent they were paying him, and then some. Nobody questioned the talent. Nobody questioned the production. That part was never the issue. Off the field was a different story. Eddie Murray was notoriously, almost legendarily difficult when it came to the media. He did not just avoid interviews. He refused them. He did not just decline to answer certain questions. He gave reporters the silent treatment in a way that became defining. The Los Angeles media corps knew to expect nothing from Murray, and they generally got exactly that. He built walls around himself that most reporters eventually stopped trying to scale. Beat writers who covered the team daily would sometimes go weeks without a usable Murray quote. Not because he was unavailable or injured or distracted. He was right there. He just chose not to speak. And that choice, repeated day after day throughout his time in Los Angeles, created a particular kind of frustration for everyone whose job involved turning baseball into stories. Now, from a player rights standpoint, this is defensible. Players are not obligated to share their inner lives with journalists. They do not owe the media their time or their words. That is a reasonable position. But for Vin Scully, whose entire philosophy of broadcasting was built on connection and storytelling, Murray's complete refusal to engage with the media felt like something more than a personal preference. It felt like a failure to meet the obligation that comes with being a professional athlete in a major market. The obligation to the fans, to the people who filled the seats and turned on the radio. Scully believed deeply that part of what made baseball beautiful was the human story behind the performance, the personality of the players, the context that gave meaning to the numbers. He spent his career finding those stories and sharing them in a way that made fans feel closer to the game. Murray's refusal to participate in that storytelling process was, in Scully's view, a disservice, not to the media, to the fans. There is also a community dimension to this that is worth noting. Some local observers pointed out that while Murray was one of the few players who had quiet interactions with the black community in Los Angeles, others felt that the team's biggest stars were not doing enough to market themselves to or connect with the diverse fan bases that made up the city. Whether that was fair criticism or not is a separate conversation. But the broader point is that Murray, for all his on-field excellence, maintained a distance that extended well beyond the locker room walls. And yet, none of this ever showed up in Scully's broadcasts. Not once, not a shade of irritation, not a hint of the private dislike that Jim Murray later confirmed. When Eddie Murray stepped into the box, Scully called what he saw: a great hitter, a disciplined professional, a first baseman who could hurt you any time the count got in his favor. The story that Murray refused to tell about himself, Scully told for him through the performance on the field, because that was the job. And Scully never let the personal get in the way of the professional. That discipline, that separation between private sentiment and public voice, is what makes this case so striking. Most people, if they privately disliked someone they worked around regularly, would let something slip eventually. A slightly less generous description, a beat of silence where there should have been enthusiasm. Something. Scully showed none of it. The disdain stayed completely invisible. Which means fans watching or listening never had any reason to question his objectivity because there was nothing to question. Number one is Mike Marshall. And this one goes back the furthest, back to 1975, back to a confrontation that in some ways planted the seed for everything that followed, even if it stayed entirely private. To appreciate who Mike Marshall was, you have to understand what he accomplished in 1974. He was a relief pitcher for the Dodgers, and that year he appeared in a Major League Baseball record 106 games. That number is almost impossible to comprehend in the context of modern baseball. Managers today agonize over using their relievers on back-to-back days. The idea of one pitcher appearing in more than 100 games in a single season belongs to a completely different era of the sport. And not only did Marshall do it, he did it well enough to win the National League's Cy Young Award that year, the best pitcher in the entire league, out of the bullpen in 106 games. Marshall was not just a great pitcher. He was a complicated, confrontational, deeply unconventional person. He had a strong academic background in kinesiology, the study of human movement, and he applied that background to the way he thought about pitching, about training, and about the culture of professional baseball. He had views that put him at odds with the traditional structures of the game. He was not interested in being a team player in the conventional sense. He was interested in being right. He would challenge pitching coaches on mechanics. He would push back against managers who he felt did not understand the physical demands being placed on a reliever's arm. He studied the body the way a scientist studies a problem, and he trusted his own conclusions more than he trusted the conventions that everyone around him had simply accepted without question. That made him difficult. It also made him fascinating, and it absolutely made him the kind of person who was not going to quietly accept anything he disagreed with, whether that was a pitching rotation decision or a broadcast description of one of his outings. One of his most famous stances involved autographs. Marshall refused to sign autographs for children unless the child also obtained the autograph of a teacher. His argument was that athletes were being treated as societal role models in a way that was fundamentally misguided, and that by refusing to participate in the autograph culture without also elevating educators, he was making a statement about what the culture should value. Whether you agree with that position or not, it was thoughtful, it was principled, and it was also the kind of thing that tends to rub people the wrong way in a sports environment that operates on tradition. In 1975, coming off his historic season, Marshall's performance declined. He appeared in 58 games instead of 106, which for almost any other reliever would still be a heavy workload. His ERA went up, his impact on the team went down, and somewhere in the middle of that season, during a road trip, something happened that would mark one of the most significant private moments in Vin Scully's long career. Marshall confronted Scully directly. His claim was that his wife had been listening to every single radio broadcast from home while the team was on the road. And based on what she heard, Marshall concluded that Scully was consistently criticizing his pitching performances on air. He came to Scully and said as much, face to face, in what must have been a genuinely tense exchange between two men who were both absolutely certain they were right. Marshall with the conviction of someone whose wife had sat at home through every broadcast and taken note. Scully with the conviction of someone whose professional standard had never allowed personal feelings to enter the booth. Two people, two completely different readings of the same broadcasts, and no neutral ground between them. Scully pushed back. He defended his reporting as objective. He said he was calling what he saw the same way he always called what he saw, and that his coverage of Marshall was no different in tone or intent from his coverage of any other player on the roster. The clash, by all accounts, was direct and unresolved, and whatever words passed between them in that conversation, the effect on their relationship was lasting and significant. Now, the thing to understand about this accusation is that it almost certainly says more about Marshall than it does about Scully. Marshall was in a down year following an extraordinary season. The scrutiny that comes with that transition is real. When you have been as dominant as Marshall was in 1974, and you come back the following year and your performance dips, the conversations around you change. That is just broadcasting reality. A 1974 appearance by Mike Marshall came with entirely different weight and expectation than 1975 appearance. And if Scully's calls reflected that, it was not bias, it was context. But Marshall could not separate the two. His academic background gave him confidence in his own analysis, and his nonconformist personality made him quick to see institutional resistance where others might see professional neutrality. He was the kind of person who, when things went wrong, looked for external explanations. And Vin Scully, as the most prominent voice covering the team, was an available target. What makes this case so fascinating in the larger context of these four friction points is that it was entirely invisible to the public. Nobody listening to those 1975 broadcasts knew that there was any tension between Marshall and Scully. Nobody could tell. The private disdain that developed from that confrontation stayed completely off the airwaves, confirmed only decades later by Jim Murray, who heard about it through his close personal relationship with Scully. Marshall's clash with Scully came from a place of academic arrogance meeting traditional journalistic professionalism. Marshall was convinced he was right. Scully was convinced he was doing his job fairly. Both were probably telling their own version of the truth. But what is not in question is the outcome. Their relationship was strained. The friction was real. And Scully carried that private disdain without ever letting it shape a single sentence he spoke on air. There is something important to say here before we go any further. Something that reframes all four of these stories in a way that matters. Vin Scully was not a bitter man. He was not someone who collected grievances or held grudges in the public eye. And the proof of that is not just in how he handled these four specific cases. The proof is in how he handled players who were far more polarizing, far more unconventional, and far more challenging to the traditional values of the game. Yasiel Puig is the clearest example. When Puig debuted for the Dodgers in 2013, he came with an energy that baseball purists struggled with. He was emotional, he was demonstrative, he played with a freedom and a fire that the old school crowd viewed as disrespectful to the game's unwritten rules. He was exactly the kind of player that some traditional broadcasters would have quietly distanced themselves from, or treated with a coolness that communicated disapproval without ever saying it outright. Scully did the opposite. He embraced Puig completely. He gave him the nickname the Wild Horse, and that nickname captured something true and joyful about who Puig was. He celebrated Puig's raw enthusiasm. He told stories about him with the warmth of someone watching a talented, energetic young man discover himself. He was, as one observer put it, more like a loving grandfather than a rigid traditionalist, and the bond was real. When Scully passed away in 2022, Puig's tribute was one of the most emotionally genuine responses from any player. He says that Scully gave him his Wild Horse name. He said Scully gave him love. He said Scully hugged him like a father and that he would never forget him. That is not the tribute you give to someone who tolerated you. That is the tribute you give to someone who genuinely saw you and celebrated you. Willie Mays is the other piece of this contrast. Scully repeatedly said throughout his life that Willie Mays was his absolute favorite player to watch and broadcast. Willie Mays played for the San Francisco Giants, the Dodgers' most storied rival, the team that Scully spent his entire career rooting against in the professional sense of the word. And yet the respect and admiration Scully had for Mays was total and unconditional. It crossed team lines, it crossed the boundary of competition. It was the appreciation of one professional for the exceptional work of another, offered without any reservation. That context is essential because it tells you that the friction with Marshall, Murray, Piazza, and Kent was not about Scully being anti-player or anti-modern or protective of some old-school broadcast hierarchy. It was about something far more specific. It was about direct violations of things Scully held deeply: professional respect, honest communication, journalistic integrity, and the understanding that the connection between players and fans was something worth protecting and participating in. When Marshall accused him of bias, Scully's integrity was being questioned directly. When Murray refused to communicate, Scully's entire philosophy of storytelling and fan connection was being rejected. When Piazza blamed him publicly for things the record showed he did not do, Scully's professional reputation was being attacked without basis. When Kent snapped that he talked too much, a man who had dedicated 67 years to the craft of informed, honest broadcasting was being told by a 40-year-old outfielder that he did not know what he was talking about. Those four things are different from a player who plays with too much emotion or a player whose style does not match your own. Those four things are personal attacks on the values Scully built his career on, and even then, he did not retaliate. He did not use his microphone as a weapon. He did not let the friction become visible to the millions of people who trusted his voice. He just kept going, called the games, told the stories, let his work speak for everything that needed to be said. There is a bigger picture here, too. These four friction points did not happen in a vacuum. They happened against the backdrop of a massive shift in the relationship between athletes and the media that transformed Major League Baseball over the second half of the 20th century. In the early decades of Scully's career, the broadcaster held enormous narrative power. The voice on the radio or the television was the primary bridge between the player and the fan. Broadcasters like Scully were trusted, objective, and largely unchallenged in their role as the storytellers of the game. Players understood that relationship and, for the most part, accepted it as part of how baseball worked. If Scully said something on air about your pitching or your hitting or your contract situation, that was the story the fans heard. Full stop. There was no social media to push back with. There was no player podcast to set the record straight. There was no direct line between the player and the public that bypassed the broadcaster entirely. The broadcaster was the story. But as the decades passed and players' salaries began to climb into the tens of millions of dollars, something changed. Players began to understand themselves not just as athletes, but as brands. Their image, their narrative, their public perception, all of it had direct financial implications. A player who was seen as loyal and beloved could leverage that perception in contract negotiations. A player who was seen as demanding or selfish had a harder road. A player whose stats were framed generously by the broadcast voice had an easier time building the public goodwill that translated into bigger contracts, more endorsement deals, and a longer runway in the league. And so the media stopped being just a storytelling partner. It became something to manage, something that needed to be shaped and influenced rather than simply received. The agent class grew. The publicist class grew. Players started bringing media consultants into their inner circles. Teams developed media relations departments that functioned more like public relations operations. The whole machinery of athlete brand management took hold, and suddenly the idea of a completely objective broadcaster who simply described what was happening without running the commentary through anyone's PR filter started to feel threatening to a certain kind of player. By the time Piazza's contract drama unfolded in 1998, and certainly by the time Kent blew up in 2008, players had entire teams of agents and publicists helping them craft and protect their public image. The idea that an objective broadcaster could simply describe what was happening without getting clearance from the player's representation would have seemed absurd to the new generation of superstar athlete. And when Scully did exactly that, because he had always done exactly that, because that was the job, the reaction from players like Piazza and Kent was one of genuine shock and offense. Marshall and Murray represent an earlier version of this tension. Not the brand management era, but the era of the independent-minded player who had stopped trusting that the media would treat him fairly. Marshall's kinesiology background and his combative worldview made him suspicious of everyone and everything in the traditional baseball power structure. Murray's silence was its own form of resistance, a refusal to participate in a media ecosystem he apparently saw as hostile or irrelevant. Both of them, in different ways, were rejecting the role that Scully saw broadcasters as playing in the health of the game. And so these four cases line up in a way that tells a remarkably clear story. They are not random friction points. They are four chapters in a slow-building collision between the golden age of objective, narrative sports broadcasting, and the modern era of athlete branding, media control, and defensive self-protection. Scully was the last great representative of one tradition, and each of these four players, in their own way, was an early representative of the new one. The remarkable thing is not that the friction existed. The remarkable thing is how Scully handled it every single time. He stayed fair. He stayed classy. He stayed on the right side of the story without ever needing to announce it. Here is what you should take away from all of this. The clickbait version of this story asks you to picture Vin Scully as someone with a hit list, a broadcaster who secretly held grudges and nursed resentments while pretending to be the good guy. That version is not just inaccurate, it is the opposite of the truth. The real story is that across 67 years, 4 players found ways to create genuine friction with a man who was professionally constituted to avoid it. Mike Marshall questioned his integrity and accused him of bias. Eddie Murray rejected the storytelling philosophy that Scully believed connected the game to the people who loved it. Mike Piazza publicly blamed him for a contract situation and a fan reaction that had nothing to do with Scully's conduct. Jeff Kent dismissed his knowledge and his voice in a moment of defensive pettiness that the rest of the baseball world recognized immediately as an overreaction. And in every single case, Vin Scully responded the same way, by not responding at all, by letting his work continue to be what it always was, by protecting the fans from the private friction and giving them the clean, honest, beautiful version of the game he had spent a lifetime learning to describe. Think about what that actually requires. To know that someone has publicly accused you of something you did not do. To know that a player is telling reporters you talk too much and you do not understand the game. To carry a private dislike for someone and then sit behind a microphone and call that person's games with complete fairness. Most people cannot do that. Most people, even good people, even professional people, would let some fragment of that emotion leak through. A slightly less enthusiastic call. A moment where the analysis tips just barely toward the critical. Something. Anything. Because that is what humans do when they are hurt or offended or holding on to something. Scully gave none of that. Not once. Not in any of these 4 cases. And not in the thousands of games he called between them and around them. The standard he held himself to was not a performance. It was a genuine, deeply held belief that his job was to serve the fans and the game first, and that anything below that standard was a failure. He did not make exceptions when it was personally painful. He made the same call on Marshall's pitching that he would have made on any other reliever coming off a career year. He gave Murray's batting statistics the same clear-eyed respect he gave every other player's numbers. He gave Piazza the kind of fair interview that most journalists would have considered far more generous than the situation required. And when Kent snapped at him, he did not even dignify it with a response. There is a reason Vin Scully is the standard. There is a reason that when baseball people talk about what a broadcaster should be, his name comes up before anyone else's. It is not just the voice, though the voice was something special. It is not just the vocabulary, though the vocabulary was genuinely poetic. It is the discipline. The years upon years of showing up with the same commitment to fairness, the same respect for the game and the people in it, the same unwillingness to let the small ugliness of ego and grievance contaminate the thing he loved most. 4 players in 67 seasons managed to create friction with that man. 4. That number tells the whole story. Not because the friction makes him more human, though it does, but because 4 out of however many thousands of players he covered across 67 years means he got it right almost every single time. He treated almost every player he ever covered with the objectivity and the dignity and the storytelling craft that made those broadcasts worth coming back to. And the 4 exceptions, they do not damage his legacy. They make it stronger because they show the kind of behavior it took to get under his skin. And they show what he did with it even then. He kept calling the game. He kept telling the story. He kept being Vin Scully. If this story hit you the way it hit us, drop a comment below and tell us which of these 4 you think was the most out of line. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. There is a lot more where this came from.